one movement with two different phases, and that's the movement to achieve equality for people of color, or all citizens having equal rights. And so the phase one was desegregating the public and private institutions, and there was multiple campaigns, and there's more campaigns to this than can be listed here. There's tons. Local areas had tons of different campaigns to do this. NAACP chapters, SNCC, CORE, tons of different organizations all had, different campaigns around this. And those campaigns, some were legal, some were direct action, some were legislative, they were all over the place. And the movement, a lot of times, allows, if you could allow for a lot of decentralized campaigns, it really helps. And then, what we're advocating is that all of that needs to be calibrated to the grand strategic objective. And they had a lot of tactics. And you guys know, in Birmingham, they did sit-ins, mass marches, mass civil disobedience, whatever. And then there were some legal strategies, right? There was a whole legal wing that did legal court challenges and whatever. And then the equal voting rights, after they won that in 1963, there was a whole shift to winning federal legislation for voting rights. And then Mississippi Freedom, these are the biggest ones these campaigns were the ones that created the moments of the whirlwind. Was the Birmingham campaign, the campaign to do student sit-ins in Nashville, and equal voting rights, Mississippi Freedom Summer, Selma campaign, and there's many more.
Let's continue. So for example, just to give it, we already talked about this, right? But for example, in the Memphis segregation campaign, you got multiple tactics, like lunch counter sittings, you can have a boycott, you can have a march. Same thing in the Selma voting rights campaign, you can have multiple tactics, like, going and applying to vote at the courthouse. And the multiple marches, like Bloody Sunday was a big deal, which we'll talk about later on trigger events and moments of the whirlwind. But just for you to see that, how is that we're actually breaking up small activities to larger and larger goals. It's just a way to organize our strategy so that we don't get confused. And when we do mass training, to tell people, look, you can do you can do anything you want, as long as it fits the objective. That's really the use of this tool. Now, this might not, this is where the discipline of the movement comes. And there's a whole way that we're going to talk tomorrow about mass training and how the discipline it's figured out and agree upon so that it's not enforced. And sometimes it might be enforced when you have a lot of violence in the movement. But at times it's just a lot of agreement at the beginning when you don't yet have all the momentum you need.
But I just want to say this, some of this strategy already existed, movements had sort of already done, but the military was really good about thinking about this, because what military strategy was a lot about is how do you give total control to your generals who can do their own thing, but all be unified around a common strategy to win the war, right? So in the movement, we're not violent, we don't have, but actually having like decentralized anarchist organizing models or decentralized organizing models, you actually need that even more, because you want to give people more autonomy. So by giving them more autonomy, they need to have more common agreement about the general objectives, and also the theory of change, and they can understand this chart so that they can understand how their campaign fits with your campaign, and it's all going in the right direction.
And just to do another example, this is the Otpor example, right? And their strategic objective, we can say it is overthrow Milosevic and implement parliamentary democracy.
And they had the method of that, which was through a strike to enforce elections. But the phases, they had 4 different phases.
The first one being individual resistance, right? The second one being unite the opposition. So in some ways they figured out how it was going to sequence out. So they knew, for example, that there were like, I don't know how many parties they were, right? 12 or something. And the problem is that when they will go and talk to people about, well, how can we win, people will say to them, well, you could never win because there will never be a unified opposition against Milosevic. So one of their actual phases of their campaign was like, okay, for us to move from having this individual resistance or small groups, now we got to figure out how to unite the party, how to unite one opposition, Then they said, well, okay, well, once that happens, then what happens next? Then we have to now force general elections. We gotta go into forced general elections. And they were like, well, but we know Milosevic is a son of a gun, so he's going to now wanna steal the elections. So if he steals the elections, we're gonna go in general strike. So that one thing builds to the other and builds to the other and builds to the other. You understand the phases? So in some ways, that's why it takes a while to do what Paul and the folks at Canvas call strategic estimate. Because in some ways, you actually have to anticipate a lot what is gonna happen in the movement. And because you are not gonna have control over people, because let's just be real, after you get 30,000 people in your institution, even to a decentralized matter, and you walk in the meeting and you say, we're doing something differently, be like, who are you? I was the founder of the movement. I was like, who? I don't know you, you know? Because there was so much, so they're going to be able to, you know, sequence that out. So it's truly an art to really think about how this emerges, and even in the immigrant rights movement, it's like there is no faces right now. It's like end deportation and what else? So we have to figure that out.
What Bill Moyers proposes is that the first phase of the movement generally is about building critical mass, building critical public support, and the second phase of the movement is generally how to enforce that or win instrumental demands. So he says there's naturally 3 or 4 phases, but they generally fit within those 2 categories. And he said in Otpor, in the Serbian model, they only taught people the grand strategic objectives and the phases, and they said, you do the campaigns. We're not going to develop them, you do it. Everyone's going to develop the campaigns bottom up. We're giving you total autonomy to do the campaigns. They just really taught people, and occasionally the Corps would come up with ideas, but really people chose the campaigns with their feet.
Yes, sir?
I have something I fear may be a silly question. I'm gonna
Wait,
ask.
are you?
Is there any risk of the opposition finding out your plan? When it's,
Well, they know it. You declared it the first day of the movement. I mean, Otpor, they had a press conference that said, we're going to have general elections and we're going to do a general strike to enforce the general elections.
well, do you think that, does that always work? I mean, is there a possibility?
Next day, press conference.
I just want to say, you know, the Otpor model was replicated in most of the colored revolutions that are known as the colored revolution, used the same basic phasing. That's one of the reasons why it was so amazing, is that the idea of building popular support against a dictator, unifying the opposition, then forcing general elections, and then having your own monitors to declare victory, and then to enforce it with the general strike, actually happened in about 6 different countries. And it was successful at overthrowing the dictator and transitioning into democracy. In Georgia, in Ukraine, and a lot of other countries. So that's a pretty awesome grand strategy. And if we could do it in the United States, it would be great. But I don't know if, you know, so we have to create a new grand strategy for different movements in the United States. But this one really applied to a lot of circumstances in Eastern Europe. It doesn't apply to a lot of, actually, the Arab Spring had a totally different model of how to do a grand strategy and strategic objective. Yes?
So, I liked what you said about, you know, anticipating what the response will be as you're planning your phases. So with the Milosevic example, you know, he's going to steal the election. But what if you anticipate their next move incorrectly, then what do you do? And then, and if your phases are built off of that incorrect assumption, then what do you do to keep it from falling apart at that point?
It's very hard. You have to, then there's a debate in the movement about whether or not to change your grand strategy.
That is tough.
But once you, so that's why they say take a long time thinking about your grand strategy before you launch. Because it's very hard to change it once you got it set.
That's also why you kind of say it should be kept broad, right?
That's right.
So then the movement.
So it's more changeable.
Yeah.
So these phases, as you see, I mean, we could fill them in more, but they were very broad. They were very broad phases.
And in some ways, it allows the core, which is what we call the group that creates this at the beginning, to be able to think, well, we're not moving from a phase, we have to create a campaign that moves us. So it creates broad enough that it doesn't trap you. But it's tough, I mean, yeah. I mean, in the Dream Movement, we went through that period of like, do we do legislative or executive order? And it was like, we could talk to people for a year and they were still like, legislative. I'm just like, people wouldn't,
It really took a year, right, like after the failure of Dream to
a
like.
whole year.
It took a whole year and a half to get initiative.
Took a while. Yes.
So following up on the question, I was just wondering, like, how did this relate to your statement of, do not give your measurements of success to the opposition?
That they defined it. That's what I meant.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
So, but most, I just wanna say this, this campaign that they're running is like a 4-year campaign, and they did, the only one that was actually controlled by the opposition, and they actually believed that it didn't matter whether or not they got consent from Milosevic. They were gonna do it regardless of what he said. So what they believed is that there was no part of the phasing that, and all these campaigns had strategic objectives that the movement can control. And this, the OPPOR made a decision around that. Gandhi did not do that, he did symbolic demands, but there's a lot of ways to then interpret how you develop campaigns that frame victory in the right way.
So, I think this is very important because now in the migrant rights movement, there's this debate. Sorry if I'm talking too much, but that's the only bubble I live in. But there's a big debate and within organizations, and I see being part of them, that like people are trying to make strategy, and usually the difference is like, we should go and talk to the legislators, and then the other group is like, we gotta get arrested and do civil disobedience. And then they're having this conversation and they're not agreeing, and what I'm noticing is that actually they're talking tactically, like they're actually talking in this context tactically, but it's because their theory of change, which is what your grand strategy is based on, is different. So what we're assuming is that at least 80% of all debates or problems come from having conflicted theories of change. Meaning how you're going to achieve victory in your movement, which allows you to say, well, do we achieve victory going this way, that way? And because that is implicit, is that how you say it, implicit? Right? It's because it's not clear. People are having tactical discussions that make no sense. That's why we say that take a lot of time to plan what is really victory going to look like, or how you achieve the path to victory, right? So, and the grand strategy for us is just a practical application for your basic theory of change. That's what your grand strategy is. It's like, okay, well, if that is a theory, the theory is to overthrow Milosevic through, right, forced elections and general strike, then how do we organize all of us to be in the same page? It's just a way to organize you from the top down to be in the same focus like an arrow.
I just want to say this real quick, and we're going to go over this, but Bill Moyer doesn't even recommend having a method. He says you should just have a grand strategy that's about building popular support around a demand without a method, because he thinks the method will emerge, just kind of like what's happening with marriage equality, right? They're all building support for marriage equality, and then the methods of how to win that are all emerging from the bottom up. Okay? So Bill Moyer doesn't even like the concept of having a grand strategic objective with method. He just thinks you should have a popular demand. Those are all, why we say 80%? Because once you have a theory of change, you can have a good debate with anybody in this room saying what should be the method and the popular demand. But that's actually a really good debate to have, and you have the same framework to argue about what would make sense for building a popular movement. But if you don't have that same theory of change, and you're arguing about instrumental demands, there's no way everybody's going to be on a different page, and you're never going to win that debate.
So before we do some reflection on this, and we get more questions and thoughts and comments, I want to give you some principles of how to organize the thinking about this, right? So the first principle is that, around the grand strategy is that the pyramid reveals that everything a movement does, from the smallest method of nonviolence to the most intense campaign, it really should support the grand strategic objective. So, I mean, it's pretty simple, right? We're already saying it. Like, the whole point is that where is the arrow going? The second piece is that the grand strategy has to fit with your theory of change, and really have to be super explicit and clear. And that's when if you want to go crazy in debates, that's the debate you should have.
What is our what is our theory of change? Active popular support. Let's say it with me. Active popular support. What is our theory of change?
Active popular support.
And this is the big conflict, because some people have a monolithic understanding of change. So their change is like, let's do more lobbying. And then you're, so then it's just, now you're having conflicts. Because some people are looking at support and some people are looking at lobbying, it's going to not happen. It's very clear that that gets defined. You know, that's why we went through all that day yesterday about that. And the last one, which I think is very, very important, is that we need to teach our own people how to be accountable to the grand strategy. And this is the tough part for us in the struggle and in the movement. Because it's how do we have highest amounts of autonomy, which we're going to talk tomorrow in decentralized organization, right? But at the same time have a strategic unity. And we think there's actually processes that we need to figure out so that that could happen in a healthy way without you feeling like you're just enforcing people all the time, which is not technically what we want to do all the time because we don't want to shut down local creativity. So that is the grand strategy. So before we go into a strategic objective, I would love for us to talk to the person left and right and say, what are you getting from this session? Thoughts, reflections, questions, and then let's do a little quick share. Okay? So let's talk. Find a person. They look just like you. They're great.
I'm really curious to hear what you're thinking of the whistle session, but I know a lot of the questions that
We spend so much of our research trying to develop a decentralized